Dr. Lee Ann Westman attended BYU from 1984 to 1988 and earned a Bachelor of Arts in Humanities. After graduation, she served a mission in the Geneva, Switzerland mission from 1988 to 1990. She moved to Florida after her mission and enrolled in graduate school at Florida State University, where she earned an MA and PhD in humanities. She was a professor of humanities at Ferris State University in Big Rapids, Michigan for 9 years, and a visiting professor at the University of Texas at El Paso for 8 years. She is now an associate teaching professor at Rutgers University in Camden, New Jersey, in gender studies. However, she was recently appointed as the Doctor of the Honors College and will begin that appointment in June. Dr. Westman teaches courses that examine the connections between history and cultural production. She is particularly interested in the relationship between gender and cultural production. Dr. Westman's research focuses primarily on Mary Jane Holmes, a 19th century American woman writer of domestic fiction who was a famous and best-selling novelist in her lifetime but is unknown today. She published a chapter on Mary Jane Holmes and the literary marketplace in Popular 19th Century American Women Writers, an article on Holmes' short story, Adam Floyd in Legacy, a Journal of American Women Writers, and the introduction on Holmes in Earl Yarrington's monograph, The Portrayal of Women's Sentimental Power in American Domestic Fiction. Her chapter on Mary Jane Holmes' traveling heroines will be featured in the upcoming book, Transatlantic Girlhood. Dr. Westman is a member of the Society for the Study of American Women Writers, as well as the Humanities Education and Research Association. In 2008, HERA appointed Dr. Westman as the co-editor of HERA's scholarly journal, Interdisciplinary Humanities, which is published 3 times a year and which incidentally was published at BYU during the 1990s. Dr. Lee Ann Westman is married to Dr. Craig Westman, and they have 4 daughters, one of whom attends BYU and is a women's studies minor. Her name is Madeline Reber, and she is one of the highlights of their life. We are privileged and excited to hear Dr. Westman's colloquium presentation today titled, But Is She Likeable? The Historical Challenges of Being a Female Artist. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Westman.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here. And very nostalgic for me. I've been thinking about my dad. When I was a kid, we used to go to my grandparents every Sunday, and every Sunday we'd drive by the house where he was born, and he'd say, look, that is where I was born. And we would think that was not very interesting. And so, but I feel like my dad today, because as I walk around campus with Maddie, I say, look, that's where I had this course, and look, that's where I studied this, and I don't think she's that interested, or anyone's probably interested in nostalgia, right? So, all right, but it's really fun for me. So I want to talk about my title first. When Dr. Hegstrom reached out to me for a title for this presentation, let me see, I'm going to go to the next slide. Elizabeth Warren had just announced that she was running for president, so this was a few months ago, and a flurry of articles popped up in my newsfeed about whether she was likable enough to run for president. And then another flurry of articles popped up in my newsfeed pointing out that likability is a question that's usually only asked about women. So I'm not here to talk about Elizabeth Warren. I just want you to think about why her likability might be questioned. And then this past weekend, 2 documentaries about Elizabeth Holmes appeared on HBO in 2020. She's the founder of Theranos. She dropped out of Stanford when she was 19 and tried to start a blood testing company, but she's been charged with a number of crimes, including fraud, and she faces up to 20 years in prison. I highly recommend the documentaries that have come out. But much of the coverage of her crimes have focused on her hair, her very low speaking voice, her black turtlenecks, which she wears all the time, and her blue eyes, and her red lipstick. Much of the documentary focused on that. Now, compare that to recent documentaries about Billy McFarland. I don't know if you know about him. He's the founder of the Fire Festival. He defrauded a number of Instagram influencers. They showed up in the Bahamas, and there was porta potties and cheese sandwiches and styrofoam containers. And so anyway, he's also facing a prison term as well. Or Pharma Bro Martin Shkreli, I think that's how you say his last name, who's also going to jail. They've all committed fraud. But as Eve Fairbanks pointed out earlier this week in the Washington Post, there's been little to no discussion of how their hair, or their eyes, or their clothing or their voices may have contributed to their ability to fool people and put other people's health at risk, nor were they described as seducing the people around them. Now, again, I'm not here to defend fraudsters, just to point out that there are these gender discrepancies. So likability, as well as evaluations of physical appearances, are definitely ways in which creative women have been judged despite their hard work and achievements. And regardless of their work, the more likable and attractive creative women have been, the more successful they've been. So again, those are just two recent examples. And what I want to talk today is about all of the ways in which the social and political and cultural norms in terms of gender impact women's creative activities. And of course, as these previous examples show, it's not only women's creative opportunities that are impacted, but also many other aspects of their lives. But this is one thing I like about examining all these creative women is that we have the things that they produced. We can listen to their music, and we can read their books, and we can look at the paintings they did and the sculptures that they created, and we can judge those things objectively. But what we find is that the reception of their work and their opportunities for professional growth were governed not by their talent. Nobody said what a brilliant sculptor she is, what a brilliant writer she is, but by things that were largely outside of their control, like likability or blue eyes or blonde hair. And I wish that was a challenge that only creative women face, but of course, there's lots more. So let's walk through these, all right? That's really what I want to do, is walk you through all these different challenges. First, one thing I want to point out, though, is that we find women writers, painters, sculptors, musicians, and playwrights in every era and geographical boundaries of I'm just going to focus on Western culture, so Europe and eventually the United States. Even ancient Greece, which is often considered the birthplace of Western civilization, and certainly a place where, at least on paper, women's lives were highly restricted. We don't really know if they were restricted because they left us no records. But we have what was told, what men wrote about them, and it seems that they were very restricted. But even there, we find a few women painters. But we only know that they existed. Their works didn't survive. And we know that they were certainly exceeding expectations for women in a culture that rarely even educated Greek citizen women or permitted them to be outside of their home. So even in these examples of artists that we've only heard about, that we can't look at their work, we see important patterns in terms of the descriptions of their work. Praise combined with insult. This is often how women are praised. they get a backhanded compliment. So the first one I want to show you, this is Pliny the Elder praised the work of Timarete by saying, she was a painter who was trained by her father, and I make a mental note about that too. She scorned the duties of women and practiced her father's art. That was the one good thing he said about her. The other is that she should be praised, even more if we consider the spindles and baskets of other women. So this is high praise, right? And that's important to keep in mind. And here's an example of how Timarete was immortalized in a painting from the 15th century. When Boccaccio wrote his mid-1300s text called Of Famous Women, in the text he included Irene, who was also the daughter of an artist, and he wrote that she was famous for her talent and her skill deserves to be remembered. And then he puts in this side note, I thought these achievements merited some praise because the art of painting is mostly alien to the feminine mind and cannot be attained without that great intellectual concentration, which women, as a rule, are very slow to acquire. So he says she was a great artist, and by the way, not typical, right? Not typical of women. So we know that there were many, many more artists in the medieval period. Manuscript illuminations and textiles were practiced only in convents and monasteries. Many scholars think that the famous Bayeux tapestry was likely stitched by women because women in Anglo-Saxon England were famous for their embroidery skills. Documentary sources tell us that embroidery was considered a commendable occupation for women, and that there were a number of convents where that were famous for their needlework. We also know, but we don't have specific examples of women in medieval convents who were doing manuscript illumination. Let me show you another picture. Oh, there we go. But very few were signed by the women who created them. So in this period, the work survives, but we know little about the women who produced them. Even these works, which actually are kind of signed. Oh, wait a minute, I have a pointer. Right here, it's her name, Clarissa. Can you see that? And this is a self-portrait. but not maybe one where we'd recognize her on the street or something. And then Gouda also put her name here in this letter, I think it's a D. So here you have Claricia hanging off a Q and Gouda here in the D, but that doesn't tell us a whole lot about them. So basically, we just know their first name and where they worked. And actually, since I started preparing to come here, I don't know if you saw this in the news, but recent discoveries have found more proof that women were very creative in the medieval period. A team of scientists were examining the skeletons of women who were buried in Germany between 1000 and 1200 AD. And they examined this woman's teeth, hoping to learn about her diet. But what they discovered were hundreds of these tiny blue particles, which was Lapis Lazuli, I think I said that right, a brilliant blue rock that was used to color illuminated manuscripts. And so this team has a theory about how fragments of this stone ended up in her mouth. They think that she was probably a highly skilled painter that kept putting the paintbrush in her mouth. And so she ended up with all these pieces in her teeth. So she's called B78. So we don't know a whole lot about her. But it suggests that women were in the highest levels of manuscript production. In other words, they weren't just illustrating. They were people, this was a rare pigment, and so they didn't just hand it out. And so it was used to make, it was highly valuable in medieval Europe, and it was sourced exclusively from Afghanistan. So, and it was expensive as gold, and used, again, to decorate these illuminated manuscripts. So only somebody with exceptional skill would have been entrusted with it. So we know more about medieval women than we did just in the past 6 months, and maybe more information will continue to emerge. We also know that in the medieval period that women had leadership positions. Hildegard wrote letters, medical texts, and she composed music, and actually now her music is available on CD. There's new recordings, in other words, of it. And Hrotswitha was a woman who wrote plays. She wrote a terrific and funny play about 3 virgin martyrs. They all die in the end, but it's a happy ending because they died with their faith intact. And so it's we may not think of convents as really radical places today, but they certainly were radical spaces for women in the medieval period. So in the Greek period, we know there were women artists, but we don't know anything about their work, or we don't know what it looks like. In the medieval period, we know what the work looks like, but we don't know the names of the people that were doing it. But starting in the Renaissance, we get to see both. We see both the work and the artist. And this is when a lot of patterns begin to emerge, starting in the Renaissance, that creative women typically face. And these circumstances are sometimes biographical, sometimes cultural, sometimes imposed by them, by geography or art academies or museums, but what's interesting is that they happen to lots of women. So that's what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about. So the first thing that I want you to know is that most women artists since the Renaissance had a father figure, or a father in their life, or other male figure who thought it was worth the time and energy to educate her. So and think back to the Greek women. They were both educated by their fathers. In the medieval period, the women are in convents, but they didn't go to the convent voluntarily. That was a decision that was probably made by their father as well. And so in the case of, I think it was Hildegard, she was the 10th child in the family, and the family saw it as tithing. They were going to tithe their last kid. So lucky her, right, that she was the 10th kid and got to go to a convent instead of perhaps dying young or contracting an STD or things that happened to lots of women in the medieval period. So most women artists were the daughters of male artists, and some of them married male artists as well. This is hugely important because if they don't get this training from their father, they don't get the training at all. The first woman I want to tell you about is Christine de Pizan, who joined her father in France at a young age, and he saw to her education. She studied Greek and Latin, not at all typical for a woman, and had access to an extensive library, which allowed her to study all these works of great literature. She also read science and philosophical texts. And around, when she was 15 years old, she married a man named Etienne du Castel. He was a member of the French court, and you're probably thinking these people sound pretty elite, and they were. He was very supportive of her interest in writing and other intellectual pursuits, and they had 3 children before he died in 1839. I'm sorry, 1389, sorry, we're at the very beginning of the Renaissance. According to some reports, he died after contracting the bubonic plague. So her father died shortly after that. So she has two supportive men in her life, her husband and her father, and they both die within a short time. And she starts writing to support her mother and her three children. She wrote poetry, she wrote political treatises, she wrote letters, she wrote essays. Her most famous work, though, is this, the Book of the City of Ladies, which features 36 women and argues that the education of women argues for the education of women, says we ought to be educating women, and challenges stereotypes that existed at the time of women as liars, sexually promiscuous, shallow, lazy people. That was, I know it's hard to imagine that those were stereotypes about women in this time period. Another interesting example of a woman whose creativity was nurtured by her father is Sophonisba Anguissola. This is an amazing story. She was the oldest of 7 children, 6 girls and 1 boy. Her father, Amilcare Anguissola, made sure that the 2 oldest girls, Sophonisba and her sister Elena, were well educated, and they lived in the household of a painter for 3 years. Then, smart guy, Amilcare had the older girls teach all the younger girls how to be artists, how to be painters. So think of all the money he saved, right? So it's like giving piano lessons to your older kids and then saying, now you teach the younger ones. Only one child didn't become a painter, the son. The 6 girls all became painters. So this is a portrait Sophonisba Anguissola did of her sister Minerva. And here's another piece by her sister Lucia of a local doctor. All right. So they have a male figure. It can be a father. It can also be a husband. This is Lavinia. This is a painting by Lavinia Fontana. This is not her. And so these creative women often married male writers or composers or painters as well, but this does not uniformly help them. Sometimes they're better off for marrying a male artist or composer or writer, but sometimes their husband's work takes precedence over their own, and sometimes their own work is attributed or accredited to their husband after they die. So they'll die and then scholars will say, oh, she probably didn't do that. He did that. So I'm going to tell you a good story before I tell you some bad stories. This is, again, Lavinia Fontana. When she was 25 years old, she married a fellow painter who was also from a noble family. His name was Gian Paolo Zappi. He acted as his wife's assistant. He did all the background work in her paintings and managed their household. They had 11 children for 20 years. And so I feel like we should have a moment of silence for him. What an amazing man, right? 11 kids. He raised 11 kids. And while she did she had an amazing career. For 20 years, beginning in the 1580s, Lavinia Fontana was the most desired portraitist in Bologna, Italy. She also painted a lot of people that went to that were VIPs at the University of Bologna. But there's sad stories, I'm sure, that you know as well. This is Clara Weick Schumann. After her parents divorced, Clara moved in with her talented musician father. She had her first concert when she was 8 years old, her first recital when she was 11. She started a concert tour when she was 12. She played the violin, the piano. She was a composer and a vocalist. When she was 16 years old, she was in great demand all over Europe. 16 years old, praised by Goethe, Liszt, Chopin, Schumann. She was well known by other composers. At 19, she was appointed to be the official court musician in Austria. Then she married Robert Schumann. He was theoretically very supportive. Like, he was a musician too, and they wanted to have this marriage where they supported each other. They had 7 children though, and marriage strained her composition time. In fact, they kept a marriage diary, which I think is fascinating, and they would write in the diary about each other, and they shared it, like they take turns writing in it, and they'd write about the work that they were trying to compose, and you can see her when you read the diary. You can see her trying to figure out how do I compose music, and his own confession that he doesn't support her as much as he should. He says, I should give her more time to write, but I like to write music. So he doesn't. He says, he even writes in the journal, I should be giving you more time. So. And both of them value his work more than hers. She thinks his work is more important, and he thinks his work is more important too. And this is another interesting story. Alma Mahler, who you probably know, her husband Gustav Mahler, she's very controversial. She was a classically trained composer as well. She had written, before she married Gustav Mahler, she had written several pieces, but her husband forbade her to compose and actually told her that if she were ugly, no one would even pay attention to her talent. So, I know. So even her biographer called her a muse. In other words, said she's not important for what she did, she's important for the way she inspired other male artists. After her husband died, she did have a lot of relationships with other famous male composers, but her biographer, or another scholar, said she might have become an important composer. Had she been born a century later, she probably would have been a conductor. As it was, she devoted her life to inspiring men. She was also very racist, and her racism was well documented, and I'm not trying to defend her. She's actually a really useful transition to our next subject, which is that race and ethnicity and class mattered tremendously in terms of having creative opportunities. They were nearly always limited to white women from middle to upper class families, and we'll talk more about that at the end as well. Even women who went to convents were often from aristocratic families. So it's only in the 20th century that we see women of color and women who don't have access to wealth or privilege that emerge as artists, but they continue to face challenges. All right, another common factor we see is limited training. Long apprenticeships that male artists had were essential to their success, but lack of training for women is a real limitation to their work. Most women were prohibited from studying the human body. Even female artists were prohibited from painting female nudes. They didn't think it was appropriate for her to be in the room with a female nude. So I know, there's no logic to oppression, remember. So someone like Artemesia Gentileschi, who covers her male body, the male figure lying on the bed. I know you're distracted by all the blood squirting out of his head, but I'm saying just look here for a second. She probably would have been a better and more versatile artist if she'd had some training in anatomy and figure drawing, but she didn't, and so she was just handled that problem with a velvet blanket, right, or it kind of looks velvety. Virginia Woolf, and some of you have probably read A Room of One's Own, created a fictional character, Judith Shakespeare, which is really a story about lack of training. I'm just going to read a little passage from Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, where she says, this is in chapter 3, she says, Judith Shakespeare, she imagines that Shakespeare had a sister who was just as talented as he was. And she writes, Shakespeare's extraordinarily gifted sister, let us suppose, remained at home. She was as adventurous and as imaginative and as agog to see the world as he was, but she was not sent to school. She had no chance of learning grammar and logic, let alone reading Horace and Virgil. She picked up a book now and then, one of her brothers perhaps, and read a few pages, but then her parents came in and told her to mend the stockings or mind the stew and not moon about with books and papers. They would have spoken sharply but kindly, for they were substantial people who knew the conditions of life for a woman and loved their daughter. Indeed, more likely than not, she was the apple of her father's eye. Perhaps she scribbled some pages up in an apple loft on the sly, but was careful to hide them or set them on fire. Woolf imagines a story for Judith Shakespeare that ends in suicide, as she's continually blocked from having the same creative opportunities and training that were available to her brother. Clearly, Woolf, as a writer, was very aware of the ways in which male creativity was fostered and female creativity was not. All right, the next point is subject matter. As far as painters go, women painters did more portraits, especially of women and children, than their male contemporaries. They painted scenes of everyday life, such as still life as well, not exclusively, but more frequently, and that makes sense, right? Like, still life is easy to paint. You can just arrange some things on a table and paint them, or you can landscapes, look out the window, or you can paint your siblings. More difficult to do historical or classical subject matter because you don't have that education or you haven't been trained to do those things. But then when they do paint these subject matters, their works are dismissed as trivial or sentimental for focusing on mothers and children. I say, well, who wants to see that? That's not very interesting. So women writers were also very successful. This is the author that I work on, Mary Jane Holmes. when they stayed within the genre of sentimental fiction or domestic fiction, but their work was also dismissed as less serious. So this is Mary Jane Holmes, who was a bestseller second only to Harriet Beecher Stowe. In the 19th century, her fiction is classified as domestic fiction, and she was part of this is a quote that I'm leaving off, part of the mob of scribbling women that Hawthorne complained about to his publisher. He said, I can't get published. There's a mob of scribbling women that are always writing books and taking my spot. And so there was, but they were writing things that Hawthorne wouldn't write about. They had female heroines. They were telling stories about women. Another factor that we see that a lot of these creative women share is precocity, and I think this is really interesting. A large percentage of creative women were professionally active, not just doing creative work, but actually being recognized publicly for their work before they were 20 years old. So Mary Jane Holmes, again, she published her first story when she was 15 years old. Jane Austen started writing poems at age 11, a satirical novel at age 14, and her most sophisticated early work before she was 20 years old. She wrote it starting when she was 18 years old. As I mentioned earlier, Clara Weick Schumann gave her first concert at 8 years old, full recital at 11, an extended concert tour at 12, and by 16 she was in great demand all over Europe. Fede Galizia, who is considered the creator of the still life painting, was 12 years old when her first painting was sold. Angelica Kauffman, 13 years old. Clara Peeters, 14 years old, signed a work at the age of 14. Nannerl Mozart, who was a pianist like her brother, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, stopped traveling as a pianist when she was 15. Stopped. Not started, stopped. She stopped because her father said, you have to stay home and give piano lessons. You can no longer travel and be on the road like your brother. Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun started supporting her family as a painter when she was 15 years old. You might recognize this painting, from a movie whose name escapes me, a recent film about Marie Antoinette. Was it called Marie Antoinette? Yeah, I know somebody, I don't know if you saw the movie, but this painting's in the movie. So, Artemesia Gentileschi painted Susanna and the Elders when she was 17 years old. 17. Judith Leister, there were public reviews of her work when she was 17. Rachel Reich, 18 years old. Mary Shelley, 19, when she conceived the idea for Frankenstein. Now, male prodigies are less common. Sometimes they are more common in music as composers, but as writers and painters, they're a lot less common. So the question is, why would there be so many female prodigies? Why would there be so much precocity? And there's some interesting things to think about. One is that only women who demonstrated exceptional talent would have been encouraged. If they were mediocre, their families probably wouldn't have invested the time and energy in educating them and teaching them. It's also, this is really interesting, good business to promote women when they were young and attractive. People wanted to go see an attractive woman play the piano, or an attractive woman read her poetry, or an attractive woman artwork or something. Their gifts seemed even more astonishing because they were young and pretty. And I love this, their families felt that they could attract both clients and suitors. So, get a boyfriend there too, or a husband probably. Some scholars think that women could make their debut sooner than men also because their works required less training. In other words, because they weren't getting years of training and doing maybe things that required less sophistication, they were able to produce their works earlier. Male artists in painting had to master anatomy and perspective and large-scale composition. Male composers had to learn all these complex musical forms. Male writers wrote in genres like historical genres or classical genres that required more training. But women tend to specialize in things like, if we go back to like Fede Galizia, a bowl of peaches, which is something that's you can master more quickly. All right, it's not enough to be a creative woman, even though they were already rare. The secret to a lot of women's success was also having a nice personality, meaning that they were good at social relationships. They were, and this is still, I think this is still true today, not just in politics with, what was her, Who's running for president? I just forgot her name. Elizabeth Warren, right? But in lots of situations, only a few women artists were able to build on this foundation and be spectacularly successful, where they fetched really high prices and were sought by distinguished patrons. Sophonisbe Anguissola, who we've already talked about, actually traded sketches with Michelangelo, and she was well known among other Renaissance painters. We've already talked about Lavinia Fontana, who was a superstar in Bologna. Rachel Reich did flower paintings in Holland, which were extremely valuable and popular. In fact, I'm saying this off the top of my head, but I think that her works fetched more money than Rembrandt's works. She's contemporary with him. Rosalba Carriera invented the pastel portrait style, which people loved because everybody looks better in pastels, so she was very popular. Angelica Kaufmann, again, we've talked about her, and Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun were all women who were successful at social relationships. Women who were more prickly, I love the word prickly, strong or aggressive, were handicapped in a culture that expected women to be feminine and kind and sweet. So, and there were artists who had trouble selling their work and had trouble getting commissions because of their personalities. Some of these are like Clara Peeters here, who actually doesn't look real friendly in this portrait, which I don't want to add to trashing her personality, but I love this portrait of her because she looks kind of tough. This is Fede Galizia, again, the inventor of the still life painting, but imagine she invented a style of painting, but I don't know, people don't want to be around her because she's not sweet. Judith Leister was also criticized for her personality. And Artemesia Gentileschi, who was raped by her tutor, then was considered kind of mean and hard to be around. So you think, well, you'd think that people would forgive her, given her life experiences. Another thing that they share is critical acclaim that fades after in other words, they're well known in their lifetime. Their work is discussed and supported by other creative people, but if we're lucky, that's forgotten because worse things happen. Their work is attributed to other people. I'd rather just be forgotten than have people bring my work out and say, look at this wonderful thing by somebody else. So, for example, Sophonisbe Anguissola, who we've already talked about, by the 19th century, her works were assigned to male artists, including Titian. So and in some cases, their names were just crossed out. Like someone said, this isn't by her, this is by Titian. Da Vinci, and this is the worst one, Coelho, who was a court painter hired to copy her work. And they gave him the credit. They said it must have been him. She couldn't possibly have done this. Mary Wollstonecraft's husband, this is kind of a sad story, wrote her biography, which he meant as a loving tribute to her. But it was such an honest portrayal of her life that he ruined her reputation for a century, and nobody would read her work because they said she's such a bad person. He wrote about her abusive father, he wrote about her sexual affairs, her illegitimate child, her suicide attempts, and she dies in childbirth when she's the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. So for a century, no one reads anything because they say, well, she's a terrible person, we can't read what she wrote. Judith Leister, the Louvre, in Paris, purchased this painting called The Happy Couple because they thought it was a Franz Hals painting. But later on, they discovered that Judith Leister had done it. They described, and then the buyer was mad. He said, but I wanted a Franz Hals painting. They're like, well, this is better than Franz Hals. Amsterdam, museum in Amsterdam purchased this this painting called the Jolly, I think it's Topper, as they called it Franz Hals' best known work, and they found her monogram under his name, like his monogram had been put over it. So here, poor Judith Leister, who already people didn't like her, now has her works being attributed to a fellow Dutch artist who was famous as well. Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel, who you probably, oh, wait a minute, there's the Jolly Topper. Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel composed a piece called Italienne, but it was published as a work by her brother, Felix Mendelssohn, who you probably recognize. Fanny Mendelssohn also rediscovered Bach by memorizing all his work, but her brother Felix is the one who's credited by historians for the Bach revival of the 19th century. So she does all the, she memorizes it all. He goes out and plays it, and people say, oh, wow, look at you, Felix, reviving Bach for us. So Women artists also faced a situation, creative women also faced varying markets. For example, women artists in the Renaissance in Italy rarely received commissions from the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church was a major supporter of the arts. However, women living in Northern Europe, like, which was largely Protestant, like Holland, had an open market to sell their work, and many women artists were able to be much more successful. So just think of the difference. In one place, the church supports all the art, and another place, you sell it in an open market, and we have all these women artists that emerge. And you know, it just goes to show that it matters so much where you live. In 17th century France, however, it was impossible for women artists to secure any training. All commissions came through the French monarchy. Academies were closed to women. They were completely closed, and then eventually they started admitting 4 women, not a year, at a time. So you had to wait for someone to die to get admitted. So like it was, you know, you stayed in the academy till you died. And so imagine knowing people were waiting for you to die so that they could get in too. So, right? So American women, I already talked about Mary Jane Holmes. Let's see, such as Mary Jane Holmes, were very successful, but are remembered as part of that mob of scribbling women, and not really remembered as being important contributors to American literary history either. The other thing that they experience, that a lot of creative women experience, is a gendered evaluation of their work and their lives. So I just want to go back to those Greek slides and remind us that, you know, these are gendered interpretations. And basically, he's saying she's good for a woman, especially when you think about what other women do. All right, and that sort of gendered view, that saying that she's good, you know, for not compared to a man, but as a woman artist, if you compare to other people, we see that a lot. And just remember, Boccaccio basically, I just love that aside, you know, that it's mostly alien to the female mind. Like he's telling us you really should pay attention to her, because it's not, you don't see this every day, right? You don't see women who are able to paint. Going back to Sofonisba Anguissola, she did get her work back by the 20th century. In other words, it was attributed to Da Vinci and Coelho and some of those other artists. But she got it back in the 20th century, but now it was bad. Like she got it back, and then they said, well, the art historian said, well, it's just, it's sentimental. It's kind of feminine. And those aren't compliments. Sentimental and feminine are that's rude. That's a saying that it's bad. This artist, who we haven't really talked about, Properzia de Rossi, was a woman who lived alone her whole life. She never married. And so whenever she went to sell her work, she was accused of actually being a prostitute. Imagine, she's a painter, and they say, well, your living situation is so suspicious. Lavinia Fontana, her work by the 20th century was described as quite well for a woman, even though she was one of the few women that was painting nudes or doing historical paintings. Gentileschi, who we've already talked about, I already told you she was raped by her tutor. And because of that rape and because her father pressed charges, she had a reputation for being sexually promiscuous for the rest of her life. Again, gendered sort of accusations, right? Leicester, once she got all her works back from Franz Hals, was called a weaker version of Franz Hals. So once all her works were attributed to her, they re-evaluated and decided she wasn't that good. And Mary Cassatt, as we've talked about, her work was dismissed as trivial and too feminine because she painted women and children and domestic scenes. So this gets us up, Mary Cassatt gets us up to the last 2 centuries. And the good news is that the 19th and 20th century, particularly the 20th century, produces more women artists. And women who write or compose or paint is no longer eccentric. She's no longer a freak of nature. The public accepts the idea that women ought to be creative. In fact, creativity becomes gendered female. In an interesting way. Women receive this kind of training with public education on a routine basis. The pipeline's much bigger, and there's many more women in it. And public education opened up opportunities for all women, especially women of color and poorer women. But this isn't good news. It's not all good news, because liberal arts are now gendered female, which means they're trivialized and devalued, and a stereotype is developed of female dabblers, which affects every creative woman who works at home or works independently. And also stereotypes people like women photographers and women writers or female bloggers, like those are all trivialized occupations because they're dominated by women. And some issues continue. For example, successful creative women in the 19th and 20th century continued to have close personal connections with well-known male artists, but I like to call this the Yoko Ono problem, which might not mean as much to you, but it's but Yoko Ono married John Lennon, and he, after he left the Beatles, and she and Beatles fans hated her, but she was an artist in her own right, and her career was completely overshadowed by his. Camille Claudel had a relationship with Rodin, and the good news is she has a room in his museum in Paris. The bad news is that she's always seen as derivative of him. And so Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock, also same thing happened to her. Her work is often seen as derivative of him. Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. Frida Kahlo has actually managed to eclipse Diego Rivera in the United States, not as much as in not as much as he's still a bigger deal than she is in Mexico. And Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz, also Georgia O'Keeffe is someone who's probably better known than he is. So that question about whether that relationship ultimately helps or hinders them is hard to say. Sometimes it increases their visibility, but sometimes their work is seen as derivative of that relationship. But, and this is what's really important, in no case did his career suffer because of his relationship with her. In no case did he say, oh, well, now I'm being overshadowed by her, and no one ever said, your work, wow, your work looks a lot like her work. It's always her work that's seen in comparison. So I just want to conclude by saying that success for creative women, for women as a writer or an artist or a musician, historically depended on being white first, and then born into the right family, particularly with the right father, being surrounded by nurturing and sympathetic men, having a feminine and likable personality, getting an early start, living in an art market that valued their work, marrying the right man. Oh, I should tell you that Judith Leister didn't marry the right man. So she was doing well until she got married, and so forth. So given these circumstances, it's really amazing that any creative women ever emerged. It might be tempting, and especially when sometimes when we think about creative people in history, we like to think that genius manifests itself in any circumstances, but it's really not true. The lives and work of these women artists suggest otherwise, and in many ways we're still living with this legacy. Racism continues to create additional barriers for creative women of color, so does the lack of family connections. Where creative women live matters tremendously, especially globally, when women are even fighting to get an education in some parts of the world. And of course, being likable must matter because it's brought up when discussing powerful or successful women. And of course, I don't think we're surprised to see that women are being judged or evaluated by their personal appearance as well. So that is that. I'm done. That's all I have. So. Do you want me to stay here, or does she just? Okay. I know where.
Okay. So if you need to jump up and leave, that's great. Are you back? Is Jess still in the room? If you need to hand in your questions, hand them in to Jess, and then those of you who can stay, we'll just take a couple more minutes and have the wrap up and a couple questions.
Dr. Westman's research illustrates the many constraints female artists have faced since Greek antiquity that were unique to their gender. Until the Renaissance era, it was rare for both the work of the artist and the artist herself to be remembered. Many female artists were able to attain success because of supportive male relations, either fathers or husbands. However, this often led to them being recognized as only a muse or their work being credited to their male relation. Most of the female artists whose work we are familiar with were young prodigies, illustrating that only women demonstrating remarkable early talent received encouragement. In addition to these other challenges, women were expected to be likable, not just talented, in order to receive patrons, funding, and attention. A female artist's success has always been complicated by reason of her gender. Her own talent or genius is not sufficient. The many dependent variables upon which a female artist's success was predicated illustrate yet another form of discriminatory sexism women face, while also offering a sociological explanation for the limited numbers of women who have been able to achieve fame and legacy for their work as an artist.
Good summary.
As you were speaking, I learned a lot because I am an art major myself. And I was thinking of I'm in the master's program now at BYU. I was thinking of my undergrad studies, and here now, the classrooms are filled with women mostly. Only a small percentage of them are men. And yet there's only one female faculty, full-time faculty member at this university in the arts, and my last one. And unfortunately, because
That's true everywhere.
Yeah.
In fact, I pulled up this poster the Guerrilla Girls made about Irish art in Ireland. This is just a poster about art in Ireland, and one of the things they talk about is that art schools are harems. They say the University of Ulster students are 69% female, and the full professors are 70% male. So 3/4 of the students are female, but 3/4 of the professors are male. Yeah. National College of Art and Design, 70% female. Department heads are 89% male. The CIT Crawford College of Art and Design students are 77% female, and department heads are 100% male. And this pipeline is strange because all these women artists are in the pipeline, but they never get nominated for prestigious awards. So you have men are 1/3 or 1/4 of the students, but they're somehow managing to get the most prestigious awards. And so your question is great. But anyway, go on.
Well, I was going to ask, in your own circle of friends or elsewhere, have you spoken with current women artists to know why they're significantly less in the workplace, or at least at universities, even though the classrooms are filled with them? So why are we seeing that?
I think it's a great question because the humanities are absolutely gendered female now, and so and in fact, even when I was at BYU, and if you entered that main entrance of campus, which things have changed a lot, but all the female students would go to the left because most of the liberal arts and social sciences were to the left, and you'd see, everybody would walk in mingled together, but then off to the left would go the female students to fine arts and to JKHB and places like that, and off to the right, the men would go to the Eyring Science Center and to the harder stuff that was on that side of campus. And I think part of it is that those studies are gendered female, and which is why we get so many women there. But where are the women professors? Like, what's wrong with that pipeline? Does it have holes in it where those women fall out along the way, or do they not earn PhDs? Do they not get hired as professors? Like, look at these numbers: 100% male professors in a 77% female program. So people are aware of it, and there's a discussion of it. But I don't know. I think here they made this poster just about Ireland, but this is true everywhere. So it's a great point. Although I do think agitating, that you as students can agitate for representation. You can say, we want to see people look like us. We want people who have stories like ours. And so I just can't imagine that there's not women available to teach in fine arts programs when there's 70% of the graduates of art schools are women. So I do think as a student, they're going to listen to you more than they're going to listen to me. They'll just say, well, we don't care what you think. But you care. You're a student. You're their audience, right? So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have time for a couple more? Okay. Perfect.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to circumstantial success, especially in contemplating different art eras. I was thinking of like Solowitt and Eva Hesse, for example. I don't think she would have thrived in any other era except the modern. So how does eras play into this ability for women to succeed?
That's a really great question. Women artists are represented in every modern art period, starting with the Impressionists. And I think it's because modern art was about challenging the institutional art style, and so those artists were marginalized, and so and the Impressionists welcomed women. They thought it made them look edgy and radical to have. We work with women artists, and so they were using women to a certain extent, it's interesting to think about how movements that don't require extensive training or about upending the system or challenging the system, we see a lot more women of color and women in those, and artists of color in those movements than we do in prior movements. So yeah, that's a really interesting point. But women don't lead any of those movements until the 1970s. So there's a long time period.
Give an example. when that switch happened and a woman was leading an era?
Oh, it was the feminist art movement.
Of course.
So, yeah. So, in fact, I don't even think there are any men. So that's how they got to lead. 'Cause
I just wanted to address her question a little bit. My name is Claudine Bigelow, and I am professor of viola in the School of Music. And I really liked your comment about agitate. And I think that there is a strategic time and way to do it that would be helpful. For example, in the music department, we have a search for piano right now. And so when you become aware of a search in a department, go to the events that are organized for that search.
that's a great advice.
Go to the committee who is hiring and express yourself about why you like a candidate. And I think that that makes a strong impression. The other strategic way of thinking about that is talking to the deans and directors and chairs of the program, and talking about these things in a very direct way and explaining exactly what you just explained now and why it's important to you. And those are, I think, critical people and critical moments that can make a difference for not only you, but for your future.
That's terrific advice. I totally agree.
I'm sure there's more of us with more questions, but thank you very much, Dr. Westman. It was really great to hear from you, so let's give a round of applause.
Thanks for having me.